The fog that night seemed to have a will of its own, slowly, almost maliciously, tapping against the windows, while the dampness seeped through the cracks like a silent warning that nothing inside was under anyone's control. The stone room of healer Nell Hart, cold as a forgotten chapel, received each breath of wind as if breathing along with it. The brazier in the corner spat out small sparks, but it lacked the strength to dispel the weight that dominated the air. In the center, Rebecca lay on a rough blanket, motionless from the waist down, as if her legs belonged to someone else. The atmosphere seemed to hold its breath, awaiting something that no one there dared to name. Graham knelt beside his wife, his wrists stiff and his hands trembling with fear and frustration, staring at her legs as if facing an enemy he didn't know how to fight. His face, marked by hard work, now carried a fragility he tried to hide, holding his breath to keep his voice from faltering. Reverend Fenwick, leaning near the door, observed everything with a gaze divided between faith and unease, as if unsure whether he should pray, intervene, or simply witness. Every small movement seemed to displace the air, making the room smaller, denser, more alive. Nell Hart, however, worked in absolute silence, moving with the precision of someone who had seen too much fear to be impressed by what lay before her. She scratched the stone floor with a piece of chalk mixed with eggshell, tracing a firm, clear circle on the dark floor. Her fingers, thin and steady, drew as if obeying something learned long ago, passed down without books or sermons. Within that circle, she placed an earthenware bowl, a handful of coarse salt, and an aged brass bell. Each object placed with a calmness that contrasted with the nervousness that dominated the others. Rebecca tried to control her breathing, but the air entered shallowly, trapped in her throat, as if the room itself were drawing her breath away. She felt her legs there, physically present, but they were like two cold, disconnected trunks, devoid of memory. No matter how much she tried to send some command, any sign of life, nothing responded. In that immobility, she felt vulnerable in an almost childlike way, as if she were being watched not only by the people around her, but by Nell's own house, which seemed to register every detail. The feeling of absolute surrender, so far removed from the strength she had always demonstrated, began to tear at a silent fear within her. As the fire crackled weakly, Nell rose slowly, assessing the circle like someone checking the last piece before something inevitable happens. The healer offered no words of comfort, nor did she promise results, and perhaps that was precisely what made everything all the more real. Graham swallowed hard, trying to imagine if this strange ritual could do what doctors, prayers, and hope had failed to achieve. Reverend Fenwick clutched the Book of Psalms to his chest, unsure if it was a test of faith or a threat to it. And amidst them all, Rebecca felt that this night would bring no peace, only answers that might change everything, forever. When Nell looked up and asked Rebecca for her Bible, the air in the room shifted as if someone had pulled an invisible current. There was no shout, no sudden movement, but the impact of those words cut through the silence more forcefully than any noise. The pastor, who until then had maintained a restrained presence, held his breath almost imperceptibly, as if the phrase had pierced not only his ear, but the very structure of his faith. Graham looked at his wife, expecting her to refuse, to say that this crossed a sacred boundary. But Rebecca only blinked slowly, tears lingering in the corners of her eyes, as if that request contained something she had already expected to hear. The pastor approached cautiously, taking the Bible from the inside pocket of his coat, holding it with an almost ritualistic respect. It was a Bible marked by years, with folded corners, underlined pages, small notes Rebecca made as if conversing with God in the margins. Handing it over to another person, even more so for an unknown use, seemed to surrender part of her own history. Even so, she extended her trembling hands, not to take it back, but to allow the gesture to be completed. Rebecca didn't understand why her heart was beating so fast. Fear, guilt, hope, all mixed together in a way that hurt and pushed at the same time. Nell wrapped the Bible in an old, faded red cloth, like an heirloom fabric kept for decades. The way she wrapped the cloth was unhurried yet firm, and each turn of the woolen thread that tied the bundle seemed to seal something important, something neither Graham nor the pastor had the vocabulary to interpret. It wasn't disrespect, nor ordinary reverence. It was as if the healer treated that book with the intimacy of someone who sees value beyond the symbol, touching it as if holding a living object. The room watched silently, trying to understand if it was an affront or profound understanding. When Nell positioned that package beneath Rebecca's calves, the gesture caused the three onlookers to hold their breath in different ways. Graham took a half-step forward instinctively, ready to prevent anything that seemed like an intrusion. The pastor opened his mouth, but closed it before any words came out, realizing he wasn't sure what he should say. Rebecca, on the other hand, felt a shiver run down her spine like a light electric wire, a strange touch of warmth and weight, unlike anything she had felt in recent months. It was as if the Bible, so familiar in her hands, now had another function, another role, a kind of presence she had never imagined. The atmosphere seemed to shrink as Nell finished adjusting the bundle, as if the silent ritual had marked a new phase of that night. The healer didn't explain why, didn't ask for extra permission, didn't justify anything. She only lightly touched the cloth, checking if it was secure, and took a few steps back. The absence of explanations made everything even more unsettling. The fire crackled in the brazier, the wind blew against the window, and the pastor, for the first time, faced the possibility that he understood absolutely nothing of what was about to happen. Rebecca, however, felt something growing between fear and surrender. A vivid, throbbing question. What exactly could Nell reveal using what she considered most sacred? Nell picked up the clay basin with the calm of someone who already knew the reaction it usually provoked, even when no one else there imagined what was to come. The water she poured was dark and heavy, as if it carried a piece of the underground with it. The cold that rose from the basin seemed to spread throughout the entire room, making the air even more tense. When the coarse salt sank without a sound, Rebecca felt a shiver run down her neck even before it touched her. That water, coming from the ancient well near the Roman wall, had a silent power, as if it carried memories of centuries kept there beneath the earth. Without warning or ceremony, Nell firmly lifted Rebecca's feet and plunged them into the icy water all at once, submerging them up to her ankles. The shock coursed through Rebecca's body like an internal lightning bolt. Not pain, but a profound fright, as if something had been ripped from her sleep. Her breath caught in her throat for a second, and her eyes widened in a mixture of surprise and fear. Graham instinctively tried to approach, but stopped when he saw that Nell maintained absolute control of the situation. The pastor murmured something he didn't even hear himself, feeling his heart race as he watched the scene with a mixture of reverence and dread. It was then that Nell picked up the small brass bell and struck a short, firm, insistent rhythm, very close to Rebecca's knees. The sound seemed to come from much further away than the metal could offer, as if echoing from some invisible space within the room itself. Tin, tin, tin. Each ring seemed to cut through the air, opening a path to something no one understood. The vibration of the bell passed through Rebecca's body with precision, almost as if it were being pulled from within. It was a simple sound, but it had the weight of something ancient, something that had once served as a warning, a prayer, or a summons for people who were no longer there to tell the tale. And then, before everyone's eyes, the impossible happened. Rebecca's legs moved. It wasn't an involuntary tremor nor a weak spasm as the doctors had suggested. It was a clear, direct movement in response to a command she hadn't given. Her knees bent a few centimeters, firm, determined, causing the water to splash out of the basin. Rebecca let out a short sound, almost a sob, unsure whether to be frightened or grateful. Her body was awakening on its own, as if it had been called back from some deep place where it had been hiding for months. The silence that followed the movement was so heavy it seemed to fill physical space. Graham brought his hand to his mouth, unable to contain the shock. The pastor took an involuntary step back, as if he had witnessed something he wasn't prepared to interpret theologically. Nell, however, didn't recoil, wasn't surprised, didn't celebrate. She simply observed Rebecca's leg as if confirming something she already knew. And then she said in a low, firm and unhurried voice, "She's awake. Now let's see how far she wants to go." And at that moment, everyone understood that the night had just crossed a point of no return. What you've heard so far is just the tip of the iceberg of what really happened to Rebecca. You're still going to discover how the healer's intervention affected her faith, her body, and the entire town. But before we continue, like the video and subscribe to the channel to support this type of content. Your help gives us the strength to bring you more and more profound and moving stories like Rebecca's. Months before that windy and frightening night, Rebecca was the most constant figure in the small chapel of Heaven on the Wall. She arrived early, even before the pastor opened the doors, wiping the pulpit with the care of someone tending to their own heart. Her voice was a trademark of the services, sweet, firm, and melodious, in a way that seemed to embrace the entire congregation. The children called her Aunt Rebecca of the choir, and the older members trusted her like they trust a clock tower, always in the right place, always working. At that time, it seemed impossible to imagine that anything could take away her natural movement, the simple joy of walking to the first pew. The first sign came on an ordinary afternoon, so mundane that she hardly registered it. He was carrying a bowl of hot soup for Mrs. Wycliffe, crossing the cobblestone street that led to his neighbor's house. It was while walking that he felt his right foot drag, as if the ground had pulled at the sole. Rebecca looked down in surprise, but saw nothing unusual. He attributed it to the dampness, the typical late autumn chill, and the haste with which he had left home. He smiled to himself, amused by his own stumble, and continued on. At that moment there was no shadow of worry, only the fleeting sensation of something out of rhythm. As the days passed, that slight dragging began to reappear at random moments, introducing a subtle, almost stubborn discomfort. It was the kind of thing she tried to disguise with a quick adjustment of her posture, a fidget with her shoe, any justification that would prevent her mind from creating phantoms. Rebecca didn't want to admit, even to herself, that something was wrong, so she turned each stumble into a funny story, repeating to Graham that the street was too crooked, or that the wind was pushing us backward. But inside her, even if very quietly, a warning thread was already beginning to form. The change became clearer when she realized she was avoiding parts of the chapel where she needed to move quickly. Nothing conscious, just an automatic precaution, as if her body were asking for more attention. She gripped the edge of the pews more often, adjusted her pace before going up to the small choir stage, and took a deep breath before tackling any stairs. Even so, she hid everything with trained ease, because she didn't want to worry anyone. Her life had always been so organized, so dedicated to service and faith, that admitting fragility seemed almost like a break in her identity. And, ironically, it was precisely this effort to appear whole that made the fall even more imminent. During that period, no one, not the pastor, not Graham, not even her most attentive friends, noticed the silent change in Rebecca's gait. She herself refused to see it. She continued smiling, singing, serving tea in the church hall, as if her body were an extension of her own devotion. But in that first shuffling of feet, hidden in the routine, lay the beginning of a road she never imagined she would travel. A road that, months later, would end in a stone room before a healer and a circle drawn on the floor. As the weeks passed, what had once been just a subtle drag began to take hold in Rebecca's routine. First came the slight stumbles, almost imperceptible to an outsider, but glaring to her, who had always had firm steps and disciplined posture. Then a strange fatigue began to settle in her leg muscles, as if each walk was taking a higher toll than usual. Rebecca tried to convince herself that it was just too much activity at church, but the truth was that her body was sending increasingly clear warnings. Even so, she remained silent, believing that with faith and rest, everything would disappear. The turning point came one cold morning, when she knelt in the chapel for her usual prayer before the choir began rehearsal. Kneeling was easy, but getting up became impossible. Her knees simply wouldn't respond. It was as if they had turned into stones stuck to the ground. Rebecca tried to support herself with her hands to push her body up, but nothing happened. Panic came quickly, hot, silent. When she finally managed to stand up with the help of a bench, she felt tears threatening to fall, not from physical pain, but from the silent understanding that something serious was happening. From that day on, dawn prayer became an intimate battle. Rebecca spent hours kneeling beside her bed, not because she could, but because she insisted, forcing her body as if trying to negotiate with God. She believed that if she showed more faith, more surrender, more willingness, the problem would recede. Her devotion was neither fragile nor performative. It was stubborn, built over years of practice and spiritual responsibility. But little by little, her muscles gave way, like light bulbs that go out without warning, leaving her groping in the darkness of her own body. Graham noticed the changes, but Rebecca always had ready excuses. She said she was tired, that it was just winter coming, that she needed to reorganize her tasks. He wanted to believe her, wanted to respect her space, but something in his wife's eyes already betrayed fear. It was a fear she didn't put into words, saving it all for her solitary moments with God. In those hours, she prayed in deep, almost painful silence, pleading not for immediate healing, but for understanding, or at least for a sign that she wasn't being abandoned by her own body or her own faith. And so, day after day, Rebecca's movement became less reliable. Short distances seemed too long, steps turned into obstacles, and the act of walking began to demand all her concentration. The worst part was the feeling that she was losing something that had always been natural, as if her identity were being torn away piece by piece. With each new stumble, a silent question began to echo in the back of her mind. What if this isn't temporary? It was a doubt she pushed away, but it returned every night, growing slowly, preparing the ground for the despair that was yet to come. The trips to the Newcastle hospital began as a quest for clarity, but soon became a tiring journey through cold corridors that smelled of disinfectant and impatience. Rebecca underwent all the tests the doctors requested: ultrasound, MRI, reflex tests, blood tests that seemed endless. Each machine beeped, recorded, printed results, but nothing revealed the reason for the increasing weakness in her legs. She tried to remain calm while waiting for the reports, but the emptiness of the answers began to open up another kind of pain, one that didn't show up in images. The first neurologist looked at the results as if observing an unsolvable enigma. He said the nerves were intact, that there were no clear signs of inflammation. A second younger doctor suggested stress, asking Rebecca not to worry so much, as if the problem in her legs was the result of disordered thoughts. The third was the most careful with his words, but the most cruel in the feeling he left. He spoke of a possible functional condition, explaining that sometimes the body creates blockages without a proven physical origin. To Rebecca, it sounded like a polite way of doubting her. Each appointment ended with a new piece of paper in hand: referrals, requests for physiotherapy, vague instructions. Graham tried to ask more direct questions, but the answers slipped through his fingers, mixing technical terms and uncertainties. Rebecca, silent, thanked the doctor like someone bidding farewell to a hope that didn't materialize. It was like entering a long corridor where all the doors opened onto empty rooms. No matter how much she searched for explanations, everything seemed to converge on a single point. Nobody knew what was happening to her body. With each visit, Rebecca left the hospital with an uneasy feeling that she was being treated as a minor case, a non-serious episode, almost an administrative nuisance. She tried to convince herself that the doctors were right, that it would pass, but the reality was different. Her legs continued to fail. The strange contradiction between perfect exams and increasingly debilitating symptoms planted a bitter distrust in her, not about the doctors, but about herself. Was the problem too invisible to even be taken seriously? When they finally returned home after the last round of tests, Rebecca carried printed sheets and generic instructions, but no concrete answers. As she crossed the threshold of her own office, she felt the weight of something much greater than the illness. The feeling that there was no clear path forward. It was as if medicine had offered her a compass that spun endlessly, pointing nowhere. And so, amidst folded papers and empty words, the silent fear of being trapped in a nameless problem was born. A fear that, without apparent solution, began to grow like a shadow behind her. Rebecca's worst pain didn't come from her legs, but from a thought she hid even from herself. Every night when the house finally fell silent, she would sit on the edge of her bed and stare into the darkness as if looking at an uncomfortable mirror. The question would come slowly, almost shyly. What if God was trying to tell her something? Not something comforting, but something correcting. The idea frightened her, and at the same time held her captive. Rebecca wondered if her devotion had been enough, if she had failed at some point she didn't even remember. It was a burden she didn't dare share with anyone. Graham could see the sadness in his wife's eyes, but she would quickly smile whenever he came near, masking her fear with gentle phrases and a practical way of arranging the blankets. He tried to comfort her with his presence, not with words, because he didn't know what else to say. Her faith had always been the anchor of their home, and seeing it shaken so silently made everything seem more fragile. But Rebecca kept her questions to herself, afraid that by speaking them aloud, they would become true. It was as if sharing her doubt would profane it. Pastor Fenwick, ever attentive, visited Rebecca regularly. He brought Bible passages, prayed with her, and tried to offer serenity through short, sincere conversations. But even in his presence, Rebecca hid her guilt. It wasn't an inability to trust. It was a fear of disappointing him. She feared that by admitting her spiritual insecurity, she would be revealing weakness where she had always shown strength. And the more her body failed, the more her mind tried to find logic in her suffering. For her, faith had never been a shield against pain, but it had also never been something that made her doubt so deeply. As the days passed, the question, "Is God listening to me?" began to seep into every corner of Rebecca's life. It was present when she tried to pray and her voice failed her. It was present when her legs trembled at the mere attempt to walk. It was present when she was alone in the kitchen, leaning against the sink, unable to support her own weight. Doubt became a constant companion, a whisper that mingled with the sounds of the house, the wind on the rooftops, her own breathing. And despite everything, Rebecca was still praying. But her prayers had changed tone. They ceased to be firm declarations and became broken conversations, with long pauses and unfinished requests. Instead of directly asking for healing, she spent most of her time asking for clarity. "Show me where I'm going wrong. Show me what I'm not seeing." These phrases repeated themselves like mantras, and deep down, although she wouldn't admit it even to herself, she felt she was losing not only the use of her legs, but also an understanding of who she was within her own faith. It was on a seemingly ordinary afternoon, while Maggie Pritchard was helping Rebecca fold some clothes, that the forbidden subject arose like someone entering through the door uninvited. Maggie, always direct, observed the slowness with which Rebecca moved her hands and shoulders, as if each gesture were being calculated to hide the weakness in her legs. After a few seconds of heavy silence, she took a deep breath and said, in a low but firm voice, "You have a wife, Nell Hart. She lives near the wall." The name fell into the air like a stone in a lake, creating internal ripples that Rebecca couldn't control. Rebecca, surprised, felt her body stiffen immediately. Nell Hart wasn't just a distant figure. She was a topic of conversation in whispers, old stories and suspicious glances throughout the village. They said she knew how to undo things stuck in the body, but they also said it was best not to approach her without a serious reason. Rebecca, so attached to her faith and the traditions of the chapel, felt a deep unease just hearing the name. It was as if accepting that possibility was admitting a flaw in her own belief, a silent betrayal of the prayers she had been making with such effort. Maggie noticed the reaction but didn't back down. Instead, she moved a little closer, resting her fingers on Rebecca's arm with a gentleness unexpected for someone so quick-witted. "I know what you're thinking," she said, "but this isn't about abandoning your faith. It's about not letting pride hold you back." Rebecca looked away, feeling the weight of the phrase. Pride. The word struck her uncomfortably because it touched precisely on the point she was trying to ignore. The feeling that accepting help from someone like Nell would be admitting that her faith wasn't enough. Inside, a silent struggle began to take shape. On one side, the devotion that had shaped Rebecca's entire life, teaching her to seek God above all else. On the other, the growing despair at seeing her legs losing response day after day without any explanation. She wanted to believe that it was enough to pray more, fast more, trust more. But something inside her began to whisper that perhaps she was interpreting everything too rigidly, as if God could only act within the familiar walls of the chapel. And this possibility terrified her as much as it attracted her. Maggie didn't insist. She simply left the name there, hanging in the air like a half-open door. "Whenever you want to talk about it, or don't want to, I'm here," she said, returning to the folded clothes. But Rebecca could no longer concentrate on anything. Nell's name vibrated in her mind like a distant, unsettling, insistent doorbell. Even trying to push the idea away, she knew that something had been triggered in that instant. A new, dangerous thought that she didn't yet have the courage to admit. What if that woman was the only door left? The day Rebecca stopped walking came without warning or visible drama. It was an ordinary morning, with the smell of freshly baked bread and the distant sound of birds on the rooftops. She tried to get out of bed as she did every day, but her legs simply wouldn't respond. There was no pain or tingling, just absence, a physical void so profound it made her freeze for a second too long. Graham, realizing she couldn't move, rushed to catch her before she fell. His gesture was quick, but the look they exchanged was slow, heavy, marking the moment when hope began to crumble. That morning turned silent. Rebecca was settled into a chair, and each attempt to lift her body became futilely frustrating. Her legs seemed part of another person, disconnected without the slightest sign of a will of their own. Graham tried to ask simple questions. "Can you feel this? Can you move?" But she had no answers. She only shook her head, her face blank with a mixture of fear and resignation. There in that chair, Rebecca had the real feeling that something had been taken from her, something that might never return. During the week that followed, her absence from the chapel was immediately noticed. The community found the empty pew strange, the choir without its lead singer, the aisle without the woman who always organized everything before the service. From her house, however, Rebecca could hear the distant doorbell calling people to the Sunday meeting. The sound pierced the cold air like a cruel reminder that her life continued without her. Each chime seemed to strike directly at her conscience, awakening a pain that wasn't physical, but rather stemming from what she believed she was losing. It was in this obligatory silence that the decision began to take shape. It didn't come as courage, nor as rebellion, but as a persistent unease that grew each time she heard the chapel bell ring. Rebecca didn't feel her faith had failed, but she felt her path had reached a dead end. The prayers continued intensely, but now they were accompanied by a new request, not for immediate healing but for direction, and that direction, strangely, pointed to the only door she feared to open. At the end of that week, as she sat in her chair, watching the faint afternoon light stream through the window, Rebecca realized she could no longer wait for answers that weren't coming. Her faith hadn't died, but it was making room for something she never imagined considering. And in that instant, without saying anything to Graham, she understood that she would seek out Nell Hart. Not out of blind desperation, but because she felt for the first time that God wasn't saying no. He was simply saying, go. The decision to search for Nell Hart turned into action on a grey morning, one of those mornings when the sky seems like a heavy blanket covering everything. Rebecca woke before sunrise, and even though she couldn't stand on her own, she asked Graham to help her get ready. He didn't argue, didn't ask questions. He simply obeyed with a worried silence. Pastor Fenwick appeared shortly afterward, summoned by Graham, and although he wasn't sure about accompanying her on that journey, he also didn't have the heart to leave Rebecca to face it without a witness or support. It was as if everyone, in different ways, understood that something definitive was about to happen. The narrow road leading to the Roman wall seemed longer that day, winding through mist-covered fields. The car moved slowly, while the landscape distorted as if drawn in pencil, without sharp outlines. Rebecca watched everything through the window, but what she saw was not just bushes, ancient stones, or scattered sheep. She saw herself, torn between the woman who had always believed in the strength of traditional faith and the woman who now sought help in a place she would have previously condemned. The conflict settled in her chest like something alive, pulsating, impossible to hide. Graham drove with his jaw clenched, keeping his hands firmly on the steering wheel to hide how shaken he was. He wanted to protect Rebecca. He wanted to believe he was doing the right thing, but part of him feared he was handing his wife over to something he didn't understand. The silence in the car was dense, broken only by the tired engine and the sound of the wind dragging the mist across the fields. Even so, Graham didn't turn back. Strange as it was, he felt this journey was inevitable, as if fate were pushing them toward that house near the wall. Pastor Fenwick, sitting in the back seat, watched the road with the expression of someone trying to decipher a prayer that was still unspoken. He wasn't there to approve or condemn, but to ensure that Rebecca didn't enter unknown spiritual territory alone. His heart raced, not out of fear of Nell, but out of fear of what this would mean for Rebecca's faith, and perhaps for his own. He kept a hand on his pocket Bible, as if it could serve as a compass on that path that stubbornly seemed more symbolic than physical. As the car finally approached the Roman wall, the ancient structure appeared on the horizon like a stone scar etched into time. The sight of those ruins brought Rebecca a strange, almost solemn feeling, as if she were crossing not just a geographical boundary, but an inner portal. Stopping before the simple house where Nell lived, she felt her stomach clench, and for a brief moment she wanted to turn back. But the door opened before she could say anything, and Nell's figure appeared, quiet, as if she already knew exactly that they were arriving at that moment. Nell's house was so simple that it almost contradicted everything Rebecca imagined about a healer. There were no colored candles, thick smoke, or strange objects hanging on the walls. The place smelled of dry wool, stored herbs, and cold stone. A small brazier illuminated the corner of the room, while shelves with jars of salt, dried leaves, and small folded fabrics occupied the rest of the space. However, there was also an old brass doorbell hanging near the door, with that kind of silent presence that keeps you alert. Nothing there seemed decorated to impress. Everything seemed functional, as if each item had a precise purpose. When Rebecca crossed the threshold, Nell watched her for long seconds without saying a word. Her eyes, deep and calm, scanned Rebecca's posture without judgment, but with a kind of precision that made her uncomfortable. She didn't look at the motionless legs first, as doctors did. She looked at the face, the shoulders, the way she breathed. Graham kept his hand on his wife's shoulder, tense, while Pastor Fenwick remained a few steps behind, cautiously assessing everything. The initial silence wasn't hostile, but laden with a perception that no one in that group knew how to interpret. When she finally spoke, Nell didn't ask what the illness was, nor did she request medical reports, nor did she question when the weakness began. Instead, she said something so unexpected that Rebecca felt her stomach clench. "What are you holding too tightly?" The question hung in the air, causing immediate unease. Rebecca blinked, confused, trying to find a logical answer, but there was no logic there. It was as if Nell had ignored the surface of the problem and aimed directly at the invisible point that Rebecca was trying to hide even from herself. Graham frowned, uncomprehending. The pastor took a deep breath, recognizing something deeper in the question than a simple diagnosis. Nell repeated the gesture of observing her, now more closely, analyzing the way Rebecca held her hands together, not for physical support, but as if carrying something heavy between her fingers. The healer raised an eyebrow, almost as if confirming an inner suspicion. There was no theatricality, no exaggerated mysticism, just a direct and uncomfortably precise reading of what Rebecca was trying to bury under layers of faith, responsibility, and self-punishment. For the first time since arriving, Rebecca felt she was in the presence of someone who saw beyond what was visible. The question continued to echo within her as Nell made space in the center of the room and gestured for everyone to come closer. The simple gesture, without urgency or lengthy explanations, gave the impression that what would happen there didn't depend on personal beliefs, but on each person's willingness to face the truth they carried within themselves. Rebecca swallowed hard, realizing that more than treating her body, Nell seemed interested in a much deeper and much more difficult territory to confront, that which Rebecca had been trying to control alone for months. And this understanding, however silent, marked the true beginning of the process. Nell asked Rebecca to recite a prayer, not the strongest, not the most beautiful, but the one she used when she was alone, without an audience, without a choir, without a firm voice. Rebecca hesitated, surprised by the request, but began to pray in a low, almost trembling tone. Meanwhile, Nell wasn't paying attention to the words themselves. She observed the rhythm of her breathing, the tension in her shoulders, the way Rebecca swallowed her own emotion between short phrases. Every detail seemed to speak louder than the prayer itself. The room became so silent that even the wind outside seemed to stop to listen to that involuntary revelation. When Rebecca finished, she felt as if a weight had been lifted from her chest and placed there on the floor, exposed for all to see. Nell approached slowly, studying her posture like someone interpreting a subtle map. Then he said, in a tone that wasn't gentle but also wasn't harsh, it was simply the truth. Your body isn't punishing you, it's protecting you from what you haven't let out. The phrase hit Rebecca like an invisible blow. She didn't even fully understand its meaning, but the emotional impact was immediate, as if someone had put into words something she had been avoiding admitting for months. Graham frowned, confused. To him, it seemed almost too philosophical for the concrete situation they were facing. Pastor Fenwick, on the other hand, kept his gaze fixed on Nell, recognizing in those words something he himself had already sensed, but never dared to verbalize. Rebecca felt her face heat up, as if someone were looking inside her with too much intensity. She didn't want anyone to notice how much it affected her, but she couldn't control the slight trembling in her hands. The truth, spoken so directly, opened a crack in the wall she had been building to protect herself from her own vulnerability. Nell continued, as if she were simply describing a natural phenomenon. You asked for too much strength for too long. You tightened everything inside. And she lightly touched the center of Rebecca's chest, without invasion, just signaling. When the heart holds what it cannot name, the body shuts down the part that makes you move forward. There was a heavy silence after this explanation, as if the entire room had understood something that hadn't yet been clearly stated. Rebecca swallowed hard, feeling shame and relief at the same time, a strange mixture that almost brought tears to her eyes, but she held them back with painful pride. For the first time since she became unable to walk, Rebecca felt that someone saw not only the physical flaw, but the silent flaw that resided deep inside, the fear of spiritual failure. She didn't know if she fully believed Nell's words, but she knew that something inside her reacted, as if that phrase had unlocked an inner door she didn't know existed. And this feeling, so new and so old at the same time, made Rebecca finally realize the ritual to come wasn't just for her legs. It was for everything she had been trying to carry alone. Nell walked slowly to the center of the room, adjusted some objects on the shelf, and turned to the group with a posture that made it clear. This was no ordinary conversation. It was a pact. She looked at Graham first, then at the pastor, and finally fixed her gaze on Rebecca, as if assessing whether everyone truly understood what was about to happen. When she spoke, her voice was firm, leaving no room for ambiguity. In here, there is no giggling mockery or noisy distrust. If any of you can't handle that, you can wait outside. The message, though simple, resonated in the room like a silent order that no one dared to question. Next, Nell made it clear that there was no room for religious disputes, doctrinal comparisons, or verses used as weapons. No arguing about faith with me, she said, glancing quickly at Pastor Fenwick, not as a provocation but as a warning. To Rebecca's surprise, the pastor nodded respectfully, crossing his hands in front of him. He wasn't there to confront, but to protect, and at that moment he demonstrated that with silence. Rebecca noticed the gesture and felt a small wave of relief, as if seeing him agree gave her permission to breathe a little deeper. The third rule came with a different weight, almost intimate. Nell asked that if there was prayer, it be pure. No shouting, no despair, no attempt to prove faith to herself or the world. Those who shout ask for strength with their mouths because they don't find it within, she explained without aggression, just with an observation that struck Rebecca like a mirror suddenly held up to her. She realized how many of her recent prayers had been laden with tension, guilt, and urgency, as if she were trying to force God closer. Nell's instruction didn't sound like reprimand, but like an invitation to an honesty she had been avoiding. A long pause settled in the room as Nell watched for resistance, but no one said anything, no one argued. Graham gripped his wife's arm more firmly, showing that he was with her no matter what. The pastor took a deep breath and tucked his pocket Bible into his coat, a symbolic gesture indicating that he wouldn't be the one leading the moment. Rebecca, feeling her heart race, simply nodded in agreement. It was strange to be there, accepting rules from someone outside the structure she had always trusted, But at the same time, there was something coherent in the simplicity of those instructions. When everyone nodded, Nell concluded with the phrase that would remain etched in Rebecca's mind. "I don't argue with your God, I only talk to your body." The sentence, though short, dispelled some of the fear Rebecca carried. It wasn't a spiritual dispute, nor a challenge to what she believed. It was something else, a parallel path she had never allowed herself to consider. And by accepting those rules, however strange they seemed, Rebecca felt she was taking the first real step toward understanding what lay behind the paralysis that had changed her life. Nell asked for 3 things, and each one fell into the room as if carrying an invisible meaning. First, Rebecca's Bible, not just any Bible, but the War Bible, marked, folded, full of notes written in moments of joy and despair. Then something that had belonged to Rebecca as a child, an object that had touched her body before she learned to be afraid. Finally, something of Graham's, a simple, everyday item that represented his work, his home, the firm ground on which their life was built. There was no detailed explanation, only the firm instruction that this was what the ritual required. Rebecca returned with a small crucifix she had kept since her baptism, almost forgotten at the bottom of a small box. It was small, light, but laden with memories of a pure faith, before responsibilities, before guilt. When she placed it in Nell's hands, she felt an unexpected emotion, as if she had rediscovered a version of herself she no longer remembered. Graham brought an old measuring tape used in construction for years, marked by dust, dried paint, and permanent creases. It was a simple object, but full of the silent strength of daily work, of the house built with patience. Nell placed each item near the brazier, arranging them precisely, almost ritually, but without theatricality. The Bible represented the faith of adult Rebecca, strong, disciplined, but also heavy and demanding. The crucifix represented the memory of her childhood, where faith was light, curious, unafraid of not being enough. The measuring tape represented the concrete foundation, the ground where her life unfolded, supported by Graham. The way Nell positioned each object gave the impression that she was assembling a map, not of places but of identities. Rebecca watched in silence, increasingly aware that the ritual wasn't about magic or manipulation. It was about organizing what was jumbled inside her. It was strange to realize that such simple objects could carry so much meaning, but there was something in Nell's calmness that made it all plausible. Pastor Fenwick also watched attentively, without interfering, but with watchful eyes, not of disapproval, but of recognition. He seemed to understand that those objects represented more than religious symbols or work tools. They represented fundamental parts of the life that Rebecca had been trying to balance alone. When Nell finished positioning them, she took a step back and took a deep breath, assessing the arrangement as if confirming that all the pieces were finally in place. "Now yes," she said without further explanation. The simple phrase brought a different kind of silence, not of tension but of preparation. Rebecca felt a slight chill run down her spine, not of fear, but of anticipation. It was as if, for the first time in a long time, she was about to see something about herself that she had never dared to look at directly. And in that small room with such familiar objects in new roles, she realized that nothing there would be simple, but perhaps it would be necessary. Back in the stone room, the chalk circle Nell had drawn seemed much more intense now, as if the silent preparation had imbued each stroke with meaning. Rebecca's crucifix, placed on the edge and not inside the circle, immediately caught her attention. It wasn't a disrespectful distancing, it was a boundary. A reminder that what would happen there didn't compete with her faith, but rather resonated with something internal she couldn't yet name. Graham watched everything with his jaw clenched, trying to understand the logic behind the healer's gestures. Pastor Fenwick, meanwhile, maintained a fixed, almost protective posture, as if guarding the space without interfering. Rebecca felt the cold stone climb up her back as Nell adjusted her body within the circle. The sensation was different from all the other times they had tried any exercise with their legs. There were no medical instructions or religious expectations here. There was only the strange feeling that the ground was breathing along with her. When Nell placed the Bible package back under her calves, Rebecca took a deep breath, feeling the familiar weight of that object, but in a new way. It was as if her faith was being used not as a shield, but as support, something that sustained, not punished. The basin of water was nearby, its dim glow reflecting the flickering light of the brazier. Even without touching it, Rebecca felt the cold approaching, almost as if the water recognized her presence. The pastor noticed the subtle tremor that ran through her fingers, but said nothing, respecting the rule imposed by Nell. The silence was so profound that each small breath seemed to echo through the room. Rebecca tried to prepare herself emotionally, but realized she didn't know what to expect. This was the first time in months that her body was about to be confronted in a way that came neither from doctors nor from faith, but from something between those two worlds. Nell observed the Bible's position with a technical eye, as if searching for the exact point where history, faith, and body met. The way she touched the red fabric had nothing mystical about it in a theatrical sense, but it carried a precision that made it clear. Every detail had a purpose. Rebecca closed her eyes for a moment and heard only the sound of the wind entering through the chimney, bringing with it that same feeling of transition, of threshold. It was the kind of silence that precedes something great, good or bad. She didn't know. But she knew there was no turning back, not after coming so far. As Nell approached with firm, measured steps, Rebecca realized that the fear within her was different now. It wasn't fear of the unknown, but of what might be revealed about herself. She slowly opened her eyes and met the healer's gaze, a gaze that promised not healing, but a search. And it was in that instant, with the circle complete, the objects aligned and the air heavy, that Rebecca felt something shift within her, as if an ancient mechanism had just been unlocked. The night was over. Neither was her body. Nell approached with the bell between her fingers, holding it carefully, as if that small object carried more emotional weight than the metal it was made of. She leaned slightly, positioning the bell near Rebecca's ear, so intimately and unexpectedly that the woman felt a lump in her throat. "When I ring it," Nell said, her voice firm and low, "you're just going to breathe and say, 'Amen,' without thinking, without trying to understand." The instruction seemed simple, but it carried an emotional challenge, to abandon for a moment the control Rebecca had been trying to exert over everything. Pastor Fenwick, sensing the rising tension, opened his pocket Bible and began to read a psalm in a low voice, not intending to command the situation, but to spiritually sustain the moment. It was a reading without performance, without a pastoral tone, almost a whisper, trying to blend with the heavy air in the room. Graham, for his part, watched the two with a racing heart, unsure whether to intervene or simply trust in what Rebecca had chosen. Everything seemed fragile, as if a word out of place could shatter the atmosphere that Nell had built with such silent precision. Nell then leaned over Rebecca's legs and pressed the Bible package, still wrapped in the red cloth, against her motionless calves. It wasn't excessive force, but it was firm enough for Rebecca to feel that familiar object in a different way, as if it were serving a purpose she never imagined. The pressure found a point that made Rebecca hold her breath, not from pain, but from surprise. It was as if that book which had so often sustained her faith was now supporting her body, a literal support, a bridge between what she believed and what she needed to face. It was then that the strangest gesture occurred. Nell, without warning, brought her face closer and rested her forehead on Rebecca's knees, as if listening to something that no one else could hear. An intimate, profound gesture, almost disconcerting in its simplicity. Graham stood rigidly still, unable to understand what it meant, while the pastor took a half step back, not out of fear, but out of respect for the moment. For Rebecca, that sudden closeness made her heart race. It was as if someone was finally hearing what she had been hiding, not with their ears, but with their whole body. The touch lasted only a second, but it left such a strong emotional mark that Rebecca felt her eyes welling up. Nell calmly stepped away, offering no explanation, as if the gesture were as natural as breathing. The bell was now inches from her leg, ready to ring, and Rebecca, feeling a deep tremor forming in her chest, realized that this moment marked the true beginning of the ritual. Not the noise, not the water, but the silent connection between faith, body, and everything she had tried to contain for months. The amen had not yet been said, but her body already seemed to be preparing for something inevitable. Nell held Rebecca's ankles with controlled firmness, like someone handling something delicate yet alive. Without announcing anything, she plunged the woman's feet into the icy water again, this time deeper, allowing the cold to surge like an abrupt wave through her sleeping body. The impact was immediate. Rebecca gasped, her chest heaved involuntarily, and an almost electric sensation coursed through her legs, as if forgotten nerves were all awakening at once. Before she could understand what she was feeling, the doorbell rang, ring, 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 in an insistent rhythm that seemed to command every muscle. The sound of the doorbell vibrated in a way that wasn't just heard, but felt. Each ring seemed to enter her legs, rise through her belly, reach her chest and return. Rebecca felt her body react as it hadn't in months. The muscles in her thighs trembled, firm, as if fighting to break through some invisible blockage. Pastor Fenwick took a step closer, unable to contain his instinct to help, but stopped when he saw that any interruption could break the moment. Graham, with clenched hands, watched his wife writhe between shock and revelation, torn between the urge to pull her away and the certainty that this was necessary. With each ring of the doorbell, Rebecca's breathing changed. Sometimes it quickened, sometimes it caught, as if her body were trying to find a new rhythm after months of functioning in forced silence. Her knees began to move, first a slight tug, then a clearer, more decisive response. Water splashed out of the basin, hitting the cold stone, scattering small reflections of light across the floor. It was as if the room itself were participating, absorbing the tension, giving something back. Rebecca had no control. She wasn't in command of her legs. It was as if her body had received an order that didn't pass through her mind. Nell didn't smile, didn't show surprise. She observed with steady eyes, as if confirming a silent diagnosis. "There it is," she murmured, almost voicelessly, but with a certainty that pierced Rebecca like a warm wire. The sensation inside her body was so new, it bordered on frightening. She felt movement, real, involuntary, undeniable. But along with the relief came fear. If this was her body awakening, what else was trapped inside, waiting to emerge? The air grew heavier, and the room seemed smaller, as if all the walls were drawing closer to witness it. When the bell rang for the last time, softer, slower, Rebecca's legs gave one last sudden push before settling. But the silence that followed was not the same silence as before. It was a tense, vivid silence, full of unanswered questions. Rebecca felt her heart beating too fast, as if trying to keep up with the rhythm her body was regaining. She looked at Graham, whose eyes were wide, and then at the pastor, who seemed to be searching for words that weren't in the Psalms. And there, in that suspended moment, Rebecca understood that the ritual was far from over. This had only been the first sign that her story was about to change irreversibly. The movement happened so fast that no one had time to react. A second before, Rebecca's legs were merely trembling, as if testing their very existence. The next instant, her body executed a full kick, firm, strong, impulsive, that sent the clay basin flying aside, spilling the dark water all over the chalk circle. There was no hesitation, no pause between command and response. There was no command. Her body moved on its own, with the precision of someone who always had strength, who never lost control of her muscles. The impact of the kick echoed through the room like a contained thunderclap, brutal in its simplicity. The spilled water didn't erase the circle, as Graham had hoped. On the contrary, upon touching the chalk mixed with eggshell, the dark water created spots that seemed to pulsate, as if they had activated something instead of dissolving it. The drawing on the ground glowed for an instant under the light of the brazier, not in explicit magic, but in vivid, almost unsettling contrast. Pastor Fenwick took an involuntary step back, moved by pure instinct, as if he were witnessing an event that surpassed his theological understanding. His fingers gripped the edge of his pocket Bible, not to use it, but to remind himself of where he was. Graham brought his hand to his mouth, completely shocked. His expression mixed astonishment, relief, and fear, a fear that didn't come from the healer, but from the feeling that his wife was doing something impossible. Rebecca, for her part, didn't recognize her own movement. She only felt her body act before her mind, making a decision against her will. Terror filled her eyes immediately. She cried not from pain, but from profound fright, the kind of fright that makes your heart believe the world has opened a crack right beneath your feet. "I didn't do it," she whispered, trembling. And it was true. Nell, however, remained motionless, observing everything with the concentration of someone who had seen it before. She didn't recoil, she wasn't startled, she didn't show enthusiasm. She simply followed the movement with her eyes, allowing the silence to fall heavily on everyone. "There's nothing to be afraid of," she said calmly, although her tone carried absolute seriousness. "The body only showed that it still knows how to return." The sentence didn't completely reassure. It was too much information and too little explanation. But there was a certainty in it that no one else could offer at that moment. The circle, now stained and alive, seemed to hold more meaning than before. The air grew thick, almost vibrant, as if everything awaited the next step. Rebecca breathed rapidly, feeling her heart race in her chest as she tried to grasp the fact that her body still belonged to her. The pastor took a deep breath, trying to regain his composure. Graham knelt beside his wife, touching her arm as if to confirm that she was still there. And in the center of that room, Rebecca understood something new and terrifying. If the body was capable of responding in that way, then what else was it waiting for to be released? Rebecca's impulse was immediate. After the involuntary kick, an almost childlike hope surged within her, as if that single movement were proof enough that she could walk again at that instant. She tried to stand, leaning forward, her hands seeking support on the ground. But before she could make any progress, Nell raised her hand firmly, not aggressively but absolutely. The gesture cut through the air like a silent command. "Don't chase after what has returned to you," the healer said, in a tone that mixed authority and care. "If you try to force it now, it will run away." The words, strange and simple, made Rebecca freeze. Graham, still kneeling beside her, looked at Nell with evident confusion. He wanted to celebrate, wanted to lift his wife in his arms, wanted to believe that this sudden miracle meant immediate healing. But Nell's tone made it clear that the moment demanded delicacy, not enthusiasm. Pastor Fenwick, sensing the tension in the air, took a deep breath and stepped back, accepting that there was a rhythm of its own, a rhythm that did not obey the logic of the body, nor the logic of traditional faith. It was a cadence that Nell seemed to understand deeply, like someone who works with forces that need to be persuaded, not wrested. Nell then took Graham's measuring tape, already set aside from the beginning, and carefully stretched it out on the ground inside the marked circle. She marked a short line, just 2 handspans, so small it almost seemed insulting. "That's all you'll cross today," she explained. Rebecca looked at the line, then at Nell, feeling pride and anxiety clash in her chest. After months without moving her legs, that minimal distance seemed ridiculous, too small to be a victory, too large to be ignored. But there was something in the healer's firm gaze that said it wasn't about strength, but about respect for what was being born. The silence that followed was dense, almost physical. Rebecca felt her body vibrate with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Her legs were still heavy, but not as weak as before. It was as if an ember lay hidden beneath ashes, yearning for air, not wind. Haste, she understood in that instant, could destroy everything. Graham put his arm around her back to help support her, while the pastor remained watchful, like a spiritual sentinel. The circle on the ground seemed smaller now, more intimate, as if the whole world had been reduced to that line 2 handspans wide. Nell, standing ahead, watched Rebecca with quiet concentration. "Your leg listened to you," she said, "but it still doesn't trust you." The phrase, strange and poetic, struck Rebecca in an unexpected way. She realized that for months she had treated her own body as an enemy, demanding, pressuring, begging, punishing herself for weakness. Perhaps that was why it had shut down. And now, faced with that minimal line, she understood that the path back would begin small, small on purpose, small enough so that her body wouldn't run away again. And in that instant, Rebecca took a deep breath, accepting that sometimes the miracle isn't speed, it's patience. Graham slipped his arms under Rebecca's shoulders, with the gentleness of someone holding something precious and fragile at the same time. He felt her body tremble, not from pain but from anticipation, a tension that seemed to fill every inch of the room. Pastor Fenwick stood beside them, not touching but offering his presence, as if his simple posture were a kind of silent protection. Nell placed the bell on the floor, in front of the line marked by the measuring tape, and rang it one last time, now in a low tone, almost like a period. The sound echoed softly through the room but carried with it a feeling of closure and beginning at the same time. When Rebecca tried to plant her feet on the cold stone, she felt something she hadn't felt in months. Weight. Not the weight of weakness, but the weight of existence. It was as if her heels finally recognized the ground, and the ground recognized her in return. The contact was small but real, and that was enough to make her heart race as if she were about to run after a long time standing still. She took a deep breath, allowing her body to try to remember what it was like to support itself. The fear of failure was there, strong, but the curiosity was even greater. Would her legs respond again? The pastor watched everything with teary eyes, though he himself hadn't noticed. Each small movement of Rebecca seemed a silent testament, not to a complete miracle, but to a possibility reborn. Graham, for his part, was so focused on holding Rebecca that he barely blinked. The feeling that she could fall at any moment made him tense, but he dared not say anything, so as not to break her focus. Nell, meanwhile, maintained a calm posture, as if she knew exactly how much strength and care that moment demanded. Nothing about her seemed rushed, and this helped Rebecca breathe more slowly. Carefully, Rebecca tried to push her right foot against the ground. It was an almost imperceptible gesture, but to her it seemed to move the whole world. And then came the response, a slight impulse, hesitant but present. The sensation ran through her leg like a spark, opening space for a cautious hope. She tried to repeat the movement, this time with more intention, and felt her knee tighten. It wasn't full strength, far from it, but it was real. A sound escaped her throat. Not quite a cry, not quite a laugh. It was a broken sigh, like someone rediscovering something they thought they had lost forever. The entire room seemed to breathe along with her at that moment. Graham squeezed her hand. The pastor bowed his head in silent reverence, and Nell simply watched, with that look that said, "Keep going," without needing words. Rebecca felt her body not only obey but want to respond, and for the first time since before the weakness appeared, she believed that perhaps she could walk again, not by an instant miracle, but by a slow and real path. That small, almost insignificant firmness had been enough to ignite something much greater within her, the feeling of return. Rebecca remained motionless for a moment, breathing heavily, as if she were about to cross an invisible border. She looked at the small line drawn by the measuring tape and felt that this tiny boundary carried the weight of an entire mountain. For months her life had been marked by impossibilities, and now here she was, about to attempt something that had previously seemed inconceivable, to take a step. Graham held her arm gently, but without holding it. The pastor, in profound silence, seemed to guard the moment as if it were something sacred. The room, once so heavy, now seemed to wait along with her. When Rebecca moved her right foot for the second time, she felt the firmness grow. It was weak, uneven, but real. So real that her eyes began to burn. She took a deep breath, straightened her body as much as she could, and let her weight move forward. Her foot advanced a few centimeters, passing the first half of the line. Then, with even greater effort, her left foot followed. It wasn't walking, it wasn't fluid, but it was movement. It was choice. It was courage. It was her body saying, "I'm still here." The emotion came like a warm wave, almost overwhelming rationality. She had crossed the line. Pastor Fenwick couldn't stop the tears from welling up, even without making a sound. He brought his hand to his face, surprised by his own reaction. It wasn't just faith that moved him. It was seeing Rebecca recover something that seemed lost. Graham, on the other hand, seemed petrified between pride and fear. He wanted to celebrate, but he was afraid of getting in the way, afraid of breaking the delicacy of the moment. The gleam in his eyes spoke louder than any words. He was watching his wife be touched by life again, even if in such small steps. Nell continued watching, serious, without exaggerated reactions. When Rebecca crossed the entire line, the healer merely inclined her head as if acknowledging an important but not definitive milestone. "That's enough for today," she said, and her voice had a weight that didn't allow for discussion. Rebecca, exhausted, felt her legs tremble again, but this time not from weakness. It was real tiredness, the tiredness of a body that had exerted itself, not of a body that had been disconnected. She let her body give way and fell seated, breathing rapidly, her face wet with sweat and emotion. The room fell silent, but not with the tense silence of before. It was an emotional, respectful, almost reverent silence. The air seemed lighter, even as everyone was still trying to comprehend what they had just witnessed. Rebecca looked at her legs, incredulous, as if seeing two parts of herself that had just returned from a long absence. It wasn't a complete cure. It wasn't a guaranteed promise. It was a beginning. And that at that moment was worth more than any words. The impossible had been touched, and now the story couldn't go back. Nell stepped away from the circle with the same calm with which she had conducted each step, as if she knew exactly when Rebecca's body had reached its limit. Without haste, she prepared something strange in a small iron kettle. Hot water mixed with bitter herbs and a generous pinch of salt. The smell was strong, almost aggressive, but it brought a sensation of warmth that filled the room. When she handed the mug to Rebecca, the healer gave a simple yet non-negotiable instruction. "Drink slowly. This will help your body understand that it is returning." Rebecca held the mug carefully, still breathless, feeling the warmth pass through her trembling fingers. While she drank, Nell explained in a few words that the night could bring rebounds. She didn't say this to scare anyone, but to avoid false expectations. "There might be tiredness, there might be trembling, there might be fear," she detailed. "Don't fight any of them, just observe." Graham listened with a furrowed brow, uneasy but attentive. He wanted to understand every nuance, every risk, but Nell's answers were always measured, as if she were offering only what was necessary. Pastor Fenwick also paid attention, with a kind of silent respect that he himself didn't seem to have planned to feel. Then came the practical instructions, so simple they almost irritated Rebecca. "At dawn," Nell said, "you will stand on the doorstep for 10 breaths, no more." Rebecca almost laughed nervously. 10 breaths. After all that? But at the same time, she understood the meaning. The ritual hadn't ended there. It was a new beginning, not a magic solution. In the afternoon, walk only to the first chair in the house. That's all. The repetition of the word sounded almost like a provocation, but it carried the delicacy of someone who knows the rhythm of the human body more intimately than she would like. Finally, Nell imposed the most unexpected instruction, how Rebecca should pray from then on. Without begging, without blaming yourself, without trying to negotiate. The phrase hit Rebecca like a firm hand on her heart. In recent months, her prayers had been a jumble of desperate requests, almost bargains with the divine. "Pray as one who accompanies the body, not as one who accuses it," Nell added. The pastor listened in profound silence, and although he didn't entirely agree with the language, he understood the intention. He himself had seen guilt corrode faith more than doubt. Rebecca finished her salty tea and took a deep breath, feeling the warmth wash over her chest and stomach in waves. The exhaustion was so great it felt like her bones were pinned to the ground, but there was also something new, a light presence in her legs, as if her body were trying to communicate with her for the first time in a long time. Graham helped her sit up more comfortably, and Nell gathered up the overturned basin, the wet towels, the remnants of the ritual. "The rest is tomorrow," the healer said, gesturing toward the door with her chin. It wasn't a harsh goodbye, but a warning. The next step wouldn't be taken there. It would be taken at home, far from the protection of the stone room. News of what had happened at Nell Hart's house spread through Hedden on the wall before Rebecca could even get up from her chair the next morning. In small towns, secrets don't last longer than a sigh, and hers became the talk of the town, from corner to corner, bakery to market stall. Some villagers spoke of a miracle in hushed voices, as if afraid of scaring away the blessing. Others, however, used harsh words, implying that Rebecca had resorted to things that displease God, as if she had crossed a forbidden line. The mixture of curiosity and judgment cast a heavy cloud over the entire village. Graham noticed this as soon as he went out to buy bread. The glances weren't direct, but they followed him down the street like suspicious shadows. He heard whispers, but he didn't know if they were accusations or disguised pity. Part of him wanted to defend Rebecca, to explain that it hadn't been a desperate search for magic, but a sincere attempt to recover the body she was losing. Another part knew that words wouldn't help. Those who want to believe the worst always find a way. When he returned home, his face bore a weariness that Rebecca recognized without him saying a word. In the chapel, the atmosphere was even more intense. Everyone expected Pastor Fenwick to condemn what had happened to Rebecca, or at least to distance himself from the situation. But he did the opposite. On Sunday, during the sermon, he ascended the pulpit with a grave expression and a pause so long that it made the entire congregation hold its breath. When he finally spoke, his voice lacked anger, fear, or hesitation. It had weight. "Sometimes," he said, "grace comes through hands that don't speak our language." The phrase hung over the hall like a silent shock, disarming those who expected open rebuke. The reaction was immediate but diverse. Some faithful lowered their heads, recognizing humility in those words. Others hardened their gaze, unable to accept that God could act outside the paths they considered correct. For these, admitting what Rebecca had experienced meant opening space for uncomfortable questions about faith, control, and limits. The pastor's sermon offered no ready answers. It merely left the community before a mirror that few wanted to face. And that Sunday, the chapel left more divided than when it entered. Meanwhile, Rebecca stayed home, relying on Nell's instructions and following the pace her body allowed. She felt ashamed of the involuntary exposure, but also grateful for regaining movements she thought were lost forever. It was difficult to reconcile these two feelings, especially knowing that many were talking about her without understanding her pain. Still, she remained strong, noticing something new growing within her, a less rigid, less guilt-ridden, and more vibrant faith. However, she knew that the following days would bring challenges not only for her, but for the entire city. Nothing she had experienced had gone unnoticed, and now everyone was waiting to see what would come of it. Dawn broke silently and hidden on the wall, shrouded in a mist that seemed to paint the world with softer lines. Rebecca walked slowly, leaning on a simple cane that Graham had improvised the night before. Her legs still trembled, unsteady, but they were there, alive, present. Each step seemed to announce a gradual return not only to her body, but to the possibility of existing without guilt. The Bible, the same one that had been part of the ritual, was safe under her arm, a symbol that no longer weighed as heavily as before. There, before the Roman wall, she felt she was closing one cycle and opening another, still undefined. The ancient wall stood before her like a scar of time, marked by stories no one alive could tell. Rebecca stopped a few steps away, taking a deep breath, allowing the cool air to enter and exit slowly. For the first time in many months, there was no desperate question in her prayer. There was no demand, no guilt, no fear of disappointing God. There was only presence, a simple recognition that life had twists, turns, interruptions, and returns that weren't always explained. And in that instant, she understood that her faith hadn't been displaced, only amplified. Graham watched closely, his hands ready should she falter, but without interfering. He knew that this moment belonged to her, not him. Pastor Fenwick, a little behind, maintained the respectful silence of someone witnessing something too intimate to comment on. Neither of them spoke, because they knew that any word would break the delicacy of a moment that Rebecca needed to feel alone. The wind blew between the ancient stones, and the mist embraced the field, creating an almost sacred feeling, even though nothing there was ritualistic. It was only morning, and yet it felt longer. Rebecca closed her eyes for a few seconds and said a short prayer. She didn't ask for a complete cure, nor strength, nor explanations. She gave thanks for the return, for the little, for the much, for what was yet to come. It was a mature, intimate prayer without the weight of the old demands that suffocated her. When she opened her eyes again, she felt a small impulse in her legs, weak but firm enough to keep her upright without the help of her cane for a brief moment. She smiled, surprised at herself, and let the emotion flow without feeling guilty about it. It was then that in the distance something soft pierced the mist, a small familiar sound that seemed to echo from farther than the ear could reach. A doorbell. Not a call, not a warning, not a spell. Just a reminder. An echo of what she had lived through, what she had faced, what she was leaving behind. Rebecca took a deep breath and, for the first time since the beginning of all the pain, felt that the future didn't frighten her. It simply awaited her. And on that grey morning, beside the wall and the people who loved her, she took her first step not as a healed woman, but as a whole woman,